Have you ever discovered that the person you trusted most wasn't in love with you? They were in love with what they thought you could give them. Stay with me until the end, because this story begins with a wife secretly planning her future around money she believed would soon be hers, and ends with karma delivering a lesson neither of us saw coming. The first time my wife asked how much my company was worth, she tried to make it sound like a joke. We were sitting on our patio. The sun was setting. Dinner plates still sat on the table between us. She smiled and said, "If you sold everything tomorrow, how rich would we be?" I laughed. She laughed too. But something about the way she asked stayed with me. Not because of the question, because of the hunger behind it. At the time, I ignored it. People ask strange things sometimes. People get curious. That's what I told myself. But over the next 3 years, I noticed a pattern. Every conversation somehow found its way back to money. Investments, assets, inheritance, insurance policies, property values, things. Never dreams. Never happiness. Never us. Just things. My name is Jabari Ndlovu. I was 41 years old, and the woman I loved was already planning a future where my bank account mattered more than I did. What she didn't know was that karma had already started writing the ending. And when the final chapter arrived, nobody walked away unchanged. At first, I honestly thought I was imagining things. When you've been married to someone for 11 years, you stop questioning every little thing they say. You trust them. You believe they have good intentions. That's why I kept brushing it off whenever my wife, Ayanda, brought up money. It started with small questions, questions that seemed harmless. She would ask about my investments while we were eating dinner. She would ask about insurance policies while we were watching television. Sometimes she would suddenly want to know how certain business accounts worked or what would happen if I ever sold one of my companies. Every time she asked with a smile. Every time she acted casual. And every time I convinced myself it meant nothing. But eventually the pattern became impossible to ignore. No matter what we were talking about, the conversation somehow found its way back to money. If we discussed our future, she talked about assets. If we discussed retirement, she talked about property values. If we discussed security, she talked about insurance payouts. It was never about our happiness, never about our dreams, never about the life we wanted to build together. It was always about numbers. At first, I told myself she was simply being responsible. Maybe she wanted to understand our finances better. Maybe she was thinking about our future. But deep down, something didn't feel right. One evening, while we sat outside watching the sunset, she suddenly asked what my business would be worth if I sold everything tomorrow. The question caught me off guard. Not because of what she asked, because of how quickly she asked it. Almost as if she had already been thinking about it. I laughed and gave her a vague answer. She laughed too, but her eyes stayed locked on me, waiting, calculating, wanting more information than I was willing to give. That was the moment something shifted inside me. For the first time in our marriage, I stopped hearing only her words. I started paying attention to the reasons behind them. And once I did, I began noticing things I should have noticed a long time ago. Ayanda believed she was being subtle. She wasn't. The more attention I paid, the clearer the picture became. And what I was starting to see made me question everything I thought I knew about my own wife. What I didn't realize then was that this was only the beginning. Because soon, one small discovery would expose a truth that would change my entire life. The hardest part about looking back at my marriage is remembering that it wasn't always like this. There was a time when Ayanda and I wanted the same things. When we first met, I wasn't successful. I didn't own multiple businesses. I didn't have investments. I didn't have money sitting in accounts. I had one old truck, a small transport company that barely made enough to survive, and a dream that seemed impossible to most people. Back then, life was simple. Some months were harder than others. There were nights when we worried about bills. There were weekends when we couldn't afford vacations. Sometimes we celebrated anniversaries with homemade dinners because that was all we could afford. But somehow, those were some of the happiest years of my life. Because during those years, we were building something together. We shared every struggle, every sacrifice, every small victory. When I bought my second truck, we celebrated. When the company landed a new contract, we celebrated. When things went wrong, we faced the problems together. At least that's what I believed. As the years passed, the business slowly grew. The long hours started paying off. The risks started working. For the first time in our lives, we had stability. Then we had comfort. And eventually, we had more money than we ever imagined having. I thought success would make our marriage stronger. Instead, it quietly changed something inside Ayanda. At first, the changes were small. She spent more time scrolling through social media. She followed influencers, celebrities, and wealthy couples who constantly showed off luxury cars, designer clothes, expensive vacations, and giant homes. Every day she watched people living lives that looked perfect on a screen. And little by little, she started comparing our life to theirs. Suddenly, the house we once loved seemed too small. The car that had served us for years wasn't impressive enough. The vacations we enjoyed no longer felt exciting. Nothing seemed good enough anymore. No matter how much we achieved, there was always someone online who appeared to have more. And the more she watched those lives, the more dissatisfied she became with her own. I kept focusing on building a secure future. I believed wealth was meant to provide peace. But Ayanda began seeing wealth differently. For her, it became something to display, something to measure, something that determined a person's value. The woman who once celebrated my hard work started caring more about appearances than happiness. And while I was busy growing the business, I failed to notice something dangerous. We were no longer chasing the same dream, and that difference was about to change everything. One thing most people never understood about me was that I never cared about looking rich. I spent years building my transport company from the ground up. I knew what it felt like to struggle. I knew what it felt like to worry about bills and wonder whether the business would survive another month. Because of that, I never became obsessed with showing people what I had. To me, money was a tool. It was security. It was freedom. It was not something I needed to display. Even as the business grew, my habits stayed the same.
Idruba practicar vehicles, I bura simple clutes.
I avoided expensive parties and flashy events. Most weekends, I preferred spending time at home rather than trying to impress strangers. People often looked at me and assumed I was doing okay, but nothing extraordinary. And honestly, I preferred it that way. The less attention I attracted, the more peaceful my life remained. Over the years, I quietly expanded my business. One contract became several. One location became multiple operations. New opportunities appeared. Investments grew. Assets increased. But I rarely talked about any of it. I learned long ago that the more people know about your success, the more they start treating you differently. Some become jealous. Others become interested for the wrong reasons. So I kept most of my achievements private. Even many of my friends had no idea how much the company had grown. They assumed I was comfortable, successful enough to live well, but nothing more. What surprised me most was that Ayanda seemed to believe the same thing. She lived beside me every day, yet somehow she never truly understood the scale of what I had built. Because I never bragged about money, she assumed there wasn't much to brag about. Because I stayed humble, she assumed I had limits. Because I chose privacy, she mistook it for ordinary success. The more I thought about it, the more I realized she had created her own version of who I was. In her mind, I was predictable, simple, easy to understand. A man whose future she had already calculated. But she never asked enough questions to discover the truth. She only saw what was visible on the surface. And that became a very expensive mistake. Because while Ayanda was comparing me to the wealthy men she admired online, she had no idea that many of them were trying to build what I had already built. She saw the modest car. She saw the simple lifestyle. She saw the quiet husband who never talked about money. What she failed to see was everything happening behind the scenes. And soon, that misunderstanding would become the foundation of every decision she was about to make. A decision the first time I heard the name Thando Khumalo, it didn't mean anything to me. Ayanda mentioned him casually one evening while we were having dinner. She said he was a successful entrepreneur she had met through a networking event. According to her, he owned several businesses and spent a lot of time helping young professionals build connections. At the time, I didn't think twice about it. People make new friends. People expand their social circles. There was nothing unusual about that. In fact, I was happy that Ayanda seemed excited about something. For a while, I treated Thando's name like any other name. Then I started hearing it more often. Every week, there seemed to be a new story involving him. A lunch meeting, a business discussion, a networking event, a conference, a phone call. Somehow, he kept appearing in our conversations. At first, I ignored it, but slowly, things began feeling different. Late at night, her phone would light up. She would glance at the screen and quickly smile. Sometimes she stepped into another room before answering. Other times, she simply silenced the call and promised to return it later. When I asked who it was, the answer was usually the same. Just Thando. Always said casually. Always said as if there was nothing worth discussing. Then came the weekend events. Ayanda suddenly had more reasons to leave the house. More business functions. More networking opportunities. More occasions where Thando just happened to be present. Every explanation sounded reasonable by itself. But when all the pieces started coming together, the picture became harder to ignore. What bothered me wasn't even the amount of time she spent talking about him. It was the way she talked about him. Her voice changed. Her energy changed. She seemed excited, interested, engaged. The same excitement I hadn't seen directed toward our marriage in a very long time. When she spoke about me, the conversations often felt routine, predictable, almost bored. But when she spoke about Thando, there was enthusiasm behind every word. Admiration, curiosity, excitement. It was impossible not to notice the difference. Still, whenever I brought up my concerns, Ayanda immediately dismissed them. She insisted they were only friends. She said I was overthinking things. She reminded me that successful people often network with each other. And maybe she was right. Maybe there was an innocent explanation. Maybe I was letting my imagination create problems that didn't exist. That's what I kept telling myself. But deep down, another voice was getting louder. A voice that kept asking the same question. If Thando was only a friend, why did she seem more excited to talk about him than she did about her own husband? And soon, that question would lead me toward a truth I never expected to find. It was a normal evening, the kind that feels ordinary until everything changes. I remember sitting in the living room, not thinking about anything important, just scrolling through my phone, while Ayanda was in another room. The house was quiet, almost peaceful. For a moment, life felt stable again. Then her phone lit up on the table. I wasn't trying to look. I wasn't searching for anything. But the message preview caught my eye. It was from Nandu.at first. I told myself not to overthink it. Friends text each other all the time. Business contacts communicate at odd hours. There could be a simple explanation. But something about that moment felt different. I picked up the phone only because I thought I should place it aside. I wasn't planning to read anything. I just wanted to move it out of the way. But as soon as I saw the screen fully light up, everything inside me slowed down. The message wasn't casual. It wasn't about business. It was part of a longer conversation. A conversation I was never supposed to see. My name wasn't mentioned, but my life was. They were talking about plans, about timing, about how things would play out when the marriage ended. Then I saw words that made my stomach tighten. Divorce, settlement, assets, future expectations. It wasn't confusion. It wasn't emotion. It was calculation. They were discussing what she believed she would receive once everything was over. Like my life, my work, and my years of sacrifice were already divided on paper in someone else's mind. I sat there, staring at the screen, unable to move for a moment. It wasn't just betrayal. It was preparation. A planned ending I was never informed about. And the hardest part was realizing this wasn't something that started yesterday. It had been building quietly, behind smiles, behind conversations, behind every just a friend explanation I had chosen to believe. Suddenly, every memory looked different. Every late call, every meeting, every conversation about money. It all connected in a way I didn't want to accept. The marriage I thought was built on trust now looked like something else entirely. Not just broken, but carefully calculated. And in that moment, I understood something I could never unsee again. Everything I believed about my life with Ayanda was about to change. After seeing that message, I didn't react the way most people would expect. I didn't shout. I didn't confront her. I didn't break anything. I just sat there in silence, trying to understand what I had actually read. Because once you see the truth, you don't always feel ready to face it immediately. Sometimes you need time. Time to think. Time to confirm. Time to make sure your emotions don't control your decisions. So instead of bringing everything into the open that night, I started doing something very different. I started preparing quietly. The first thing I did was speak to legal experts. Not in an emotional way, not in a dramatic way, just simple, direct conversations about how everything was structured, what rights existed, and what would happen if things ever reached divorce. Then I began reviewing everything I had built over the years. Every business, every account, every investment, every document I had signed without thinking too deeply at the time. For the first time, I looked at my own life the way a stranger would, carefully, objectively, without emotion, and what I found was something I needed to fix before anyone else tried to interpret it for me. I updated records that needed clarity. I verified ownership documents that had been sitting untouched for years. I reorganized financial structures that were far more complicated than most people realized. Not because I wanted conflict, but because I wanted clarity. At the same time, I watched Ayanda closely, without showing her that anything had changed. And what surprised me most was how normal everything seemed to her. She was calm, relaxed, almost confident. It was as if she believed everything was already moving exactly in the direction she had planned. She made future comments without hesitation. She talked about life after marriage as if it was already decided, as if nothing could change the outcome she had imagined. But what she didn't realize was something very important. The future she was building in her mind was based on assumptions. Not facts, not structure, not reality, just expectations shaped by what she thought she understood about me. And while she was preparing emotionally for an ending she believed was certain, I was preparing in a completely different way. Quietly, carefully, step by step, not to create conflict, but to make sure that when reality finally arrived, it would not be based on assumptions from either side. Because sometimes the biggest shift doesn't happen in a moment of confrontation. It happens in silence, when one person thinks everything is under control, and the other person is simply making sure nothing is left to chance. The day Ayanda finally filed for divorce, she didn't look sad. She looked sure. There was a kind of confidence in her face that I had never seen before. Not nervous confidence, but the kind that comes when someone believes they already know how everything will end. I remember how calm she was that morning, almost peaceful. Like she had already stepped out of the marriage emotionally and was just waiting for the paperwork to catch up. She didn't argue. She didn't hesitate. She didn't try to fix anything. She simply moved forward as if the decision had already been made long ago. And what hurt most was not the divorce itself. It was how certain she was that she was making the right move. She believed there was a future waiting on the other side of this. A better life, a richer life. A life where everything she had imagined would finally come true. In her mind, the marriage wasn't just ending. It was cashing out. I started hearing things through distance and silence. Friends of hers congratulating her quietly. People speaking in half sentences, hinting at what she might receive. Some even talking about what she would buy, where she would move, how her life would change once everything was settled. It was as if the outcome was already decided and everyone around her had accepted it except me. But I stayed quiet, because by that point I already understood something she didn't. Time passed, and the expectations she had built started colliding with reality. The first shock came when she realized the structure of everything was not what she thought it was. Assets she believed were directly accessible were not in the form she expected. Businesses she assumed would automatically translate into payouts were not set up the way she had imagined. Accounts she had mentally divided were not hers to divide. Piece by piece, the picture she had built in her mind started falling apart. And with every new realization, her confidence slowly began to change. First, it was confusion, then disbelief, then silence, and finally, something I had never seen in her before: fear. Because for the first time since this entire process began, she was no longer certain about the outcome she had been celebrating. The future she had been so confident about no longer looked guaranteed, and the life she thought was waiting for her suddenly felt very different from the one she had imagined. While everything was falling apart in my marriage, something unexpected was happening in the background. The same man Ayanda had once looked at with admiration, Thando Kimalo, was starting to lose control of the image he had built. First, nobody noticed it clearly. Things like this don't collapse in one day. They start quietly, almost invisibly. Small delays in payments, Strange rumors in business circles, unanswered calls, meetings that suddenly get postponed. Then slowly the truth starts leaking out. Debt that was never spoken about began to surface. Financial pressure that had been hidden behind luxury appearances started becoming harder to cover. The image of success that looked so perfect from the outside was starting to crack in real life. Investors became cautious. Business partners began stepping away one by one. People who once praised him started distancing themselves, pretending they were never deeply involved. And the lifestyle that once looked effortless suddenly started looking expensive to maintain. Cars, events, travel, appearances, everything required money that was no longer flowing the way it used to. What looked like stability was actually built on pressure. And pressure never stays hidden forever. At the same time, something else was happening in my life, but in the opposite direction. While chaos was building around Thando, my businesses were growing stronger. Quietly, steadily, without noise. Contracts that had been delayed started getting approved. New opportunities came in without me chasing them. Long-term decisions I had made years ago started paying off in ways I never publicly talked about. It wasn't sudden success. It was the result of years of consistency, years of discipline, years of staying focused while others were distracted by appearances. And the contrast between both worlds became impossible to ignore. The man Ayanda believed represented a better future was struggling to hold everything together. And the man she once thought was ordinary was building stability she had never truly understood. As her chosen path began collapsing under its own weight, my life continued moving forward without disruption. Not loudly, not dramatically, just forward. And slowly, the reality she had ignored started becoming clearer with every passing day. Because sometimes what looks like a shortcut to a better life turns out to be the beginning of a much harder fall. It was months later when I got the message from Ayanda asking to meet. Just a simple request. No long explanation. No pressure. Just a quiet message asking if we could talk in private. For a moment, I stared at it without replying. Because I already knew this wasn't the same version of her I had once lived with. When we finally met, she didn't arrive the way she used to. There was no confidence in her walk, no sharp energy in her voice, no sense of control. She looked like someone who had gone through a long, silent battle that nobody else had seen. When she sat down, she didn't start with excuses. She didn't try to defend anything. That surprised me more than anything else. Instead, there was silence at first. Heavy silence, the kind that carries everything that was never said before. Then slowly, she began to speak. Her voice was softer, slower, more careful. She said she didn't come to argue anymore. She said she just wanted to be honest for once. And then she admitted something I didn't expect to hear from her. She said she had lost sight of what actually mattered, not just in the marriage, but in life. She said she had confused wealth with worth, and in chasing the idea of a better life, she had stopped valuing the life she already had. As she spoke, her eyes filled with emotion. Not dramatic tears, but the kind that come when someone finally understands something too late. She talked about pressure, about comparisons, about how easy it was to get lost in other people's lives online, and how slowly, without even realizing it, she had started believing that happiness always looked like something bigger, something more expensive, something outside of what we had. For the first time, she wasn't trying to win the conversation. She was just speaking truthfully, and I listened. Not because I was unsure, but because I needed to hear everything she had to say. When she finished, there was another long silence between us. The kind that doesn't need interruption, because it already says everything. The truth was clear in that moment. She had finally understood what she lost. But understanding came after everything had already changed. After decisions were made. After trust was broken. After the story had already moved beyond the point where apologies could rebuild it. And that realization sat between us heavier than anything else she said that day. 1 year had passed since everything changed. Life didn't explode into some dramatic ending like people expect in stories. Instead, it moved forward quietly, slowly, and then steadily into something better. That morning, I was standing outside a new logistics facility. A place that didn't exist in my life a few years ago. A place built from years of patience, late nights, risks, and decisions most people never saw. The building was large, active and full of movement, trucks arriving, workers coordinating, systems running smoothly. Everything I had once dreamed about when I was struggling with just one old truck. But this time I wasn't stressed. I wasn't worried. I wasn't chasing survival anymore. I was simply observing what discipline had built over time. There was a strange peace in that moment, the kind you only understand after surviving chaos, after confusion, after betrayal, after silence. My life wasn't perfect, but it was stable. And stability is something you only truly appreciate when you've lost it before. As I stood there, I thought about everything that had happened. The marriage, the misunderstandings, the choices, the silence that followed, and the truth that was eventually revealed. Ayanda had once believed she was moving toward a better future. She thought she was choosing something greater, something more valuable, but she never truly understood what she already had. She saw money. She saw potential. She saw what she assumed my life represented. But she never saw the person behind it. And that became the biggest mistake of all. Because in the end, karma doesn't always look like punishment. Sometimes it looks like clarity, like reality slowly revealing itself without noise.
No revenge, no shouting, no dramatic collapse.
Just truth unfolding over time. She didn't lose everything in the way people imagine. What she lost was something deeper, the realization of what she walked away from. Because once you finally understand the value of what you had, it is often already too late to return to it. Standing there that day, I finally understood something important. Life doesn't always give loud endings. Sometimes it just gives silence. And in that silence, you either find peace or regret. And for me, for the first time in a long time, it was peace.